with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Monday, June 5th, 2023. My name is Sam Seder. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Steve Vladeck, chair in federal courts at the University of Texas School of Law, author of The Shadow Docket, how the Supreme Court uses stealth rulings to amass power and to undermine the Republic. Meanwhile, it appears Ukraine may have begun its much-anticipated offensive. Joe Biden signed the debt deal bill just as commercial real estate lays the groundwork for its bailout. The Directors Guild of America assigns a deal with the studios, as studios hope it's going to undercut the Writers Guild's resolve. New report, Twitter ad sales are down 60% year over year. Got one piece of sound for that. Ooh. Trump judge strikes down Tennessee's anti-drag law as too broad. Abbott, governor of Texas, signs legislation banning trans youth from gender-affirming medical care. 17th state, I believe, which we have seen such bans. Allstate joins State Farm in no longer offering new homeowners policies in California because of climate change threats. Chris Christie, Burgum, and now Pence, officially a candidate, all entering the Republican vice presidential and book sales sweepstakes this week. Ben & Jerry's employees will be getting a union as Ben & Jerry's voluntarily recognizes Scoopers Union. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. Beginning of the week, it is, as you know, Monday.
Yes, it is.
Emma Vigeland has returned to the program.
Fun Day Monday, right? That's what we call it?
Sure.
I guess. I don't even remember what our Monday moniker is.
Matt is out. There's some type of bug going around, ladies and gentlemen. So
yeah.
Be
Plus
careful out
COVID,
there.
too. If you're in New York City, probably if you're in the rest of the country, just watch out, because there might be a surge coming.
I don't know how big of one, but they track this stuff through the sewage still, and no fun. No fun to catch it still. Fortunately, there's enough immunity, both from vaccinations and sadly people getting it in the past, that have made it far less lethal. And of course, we don't know the implications. Well, we know in some instances the implications of long COVID, but we also don't know the implications of COVID 10, 20, 30 years down the road. I will remind you that shingles, one of the most painful things that you can go through as an adult in terms of a virus, comes from having been infected by the chickenpox virus sometimes 40, 50, 30, 60 years earlier. So, and based upon what we know in terms of COVID and what it does to really all the organs in one's body. It is certainly not outside the bounds of reason to anticipate there could be long-term problems aside from what long COVID actually provides. So if you can avoid that, do it. I still, myself, depending on the context, will be wearing masks. I always wear them on the subway. I wear them if I ever take a taxi. If I go into a movie theater, I still wear a mask. Very few people do. It's just, and I'll even drop it to eat some food. But if I'm going to be in a prolonged location in close proximity to other people, that's basically a public place that doesn't necessarily have high ceilings or good air circulation, I'll wear a mask. But the most part, obviously, a lot of people have relaxed those. And if I go in and I know that, let's say I'm getting a haircut, just out of respect for the people who are cutting my hair,
Right.
I wear a mask because
You're in close proximity.
yeah, I don't need to give them anxiety. But that's that for today. The Republican presidential race is, I don't know, heating up is really the right word.
Filling up maybe is better.
Filling up. But what is fascinating is
Saturation.
we're going to play two clips. There's two lanes, right? I mean, theoretically, if we are to listen to the conventional wisdom, there's two lanes. One is the Trump lane, and one is the reasonable Republican lane. But really, to the extent that there's two lanes, it's pro-Trump and anti-Trump, because there's no difference ideologically between these two lanes, because they are vying for the exact same monolithic voting bloc that is in the Republican Party. The Democratic Party has many different voting blocks. The Republican Party is largely monolithic, which is at least the base that everybody's going for on either side of the party, theoretically, or either party at this far out from an election.
And to the extent, honestly, I think that if you're in the anti-Trump bloc, there are going to be some Republicans making that choice based on electability, too. I think that there's some Republicans who think, oh, DeSantis has a better shot. Trump, they'll never give it to him anymore. It doesn't mean that their heart doesn't still lie with the Trumpism in the party.
Right. And I would also say that, they are vying for DeSantis's vice presidents. I mean, understand, there's two people who could possibly win, and that is DeSantis and Trump. Although if Trump has a heart attack or gets hit by a bus or something like that, or is in jail, the race opens up quite a bit. Then people are going to be vying to be the anti-DeSantis candidate.
I was meaning the voters, but yes, that's what I hear what you're saying.
But here is Ron DeSantis doing his best impression of Winston Churchill. Well, let's play Churchill first, just so you get a sense of just how much history has degraded rhetoric. This is Churchill, I think, upon announcing the entrance into World War II, or thereabouts. Certainly, in terms of fighting the juggernaut that was Nazi Germany at this time.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it was subjugated.
Okay. And then he goes on to talk about, the possibility of them being occupied or invaded. But that's not the point. Here is how far we have fallen as a species. I give you Governor Ron DeSantis. In Iowa, what is this? The ride or die? Is
This is Senator Joni Ernst's event that she does for the Roast and Ride.
Roast and Ride. There you go.
As president, I recognize that the woke mind virus represents a war on the truth, so we will wage a war on the woke. We will fight the woke in education. We will fight the woke in the corporations. We will fight the woke in the halls of Congress. We will never, ever surrender to the woke mob. We will make woke ideology, leave it to the dustbin of history. It's gone.
Again, we could go through. We don't need any more of that. I mean, again,
tears in my eyes.
Yeah, that was really inspiring. The woke ideology, of course, is, as far as we know, because they don't really say what it is, right? It is the idea of teaching about the history of the United States, the idea of recognizing that things like discrimination exists both on a societal, cultural, and institutional level. And even this type of racism and bigotry and discrimination exists even where that wasn't necessarily the intent. But it reflects the makeup and the power dynamics of society that have existed in this country. So when you hear that the IRS basically, after taking a study, realizes that they audit black people at significantly higher rates than white people, you ask yourself, why is that? And it is because the way that our tax laws were structured, and who had the power in structuring the tax laws? It was white people. And they weren't even necessarily structuring these tax laws in a way to disadvantage black people. It just so happens they had the power, and people with power structure society in a way that benefits them. And there's plenty of examples of this. But just in case you thought it was just Ron D. or DeSantis.
Right. Because, the general consensus among people who, like the Club for Growth people backing him, is that he might talk like Trump and say some of the crazy Trump stuff, but we can work with this guy, right? So he has to appeal to the MAGA base, but he really is one of us. And the other candidates are supposed to be even more moderate than DeSantis, at least in the public-facing way, right?
But they all know there is one ticket to a Republican presidency, and that is through, you want to call it fascism, bigotry, prejudice, attacking people who are marginalized in terms of their power in society. Here is the very reasonable Nikki Haley making a completely unfounded and batcrap crazy claim.
Woke, the word woke, used to be used by progressives to talk about an awareness of inequities and historical inequities. But obviously it means something else to conservatives criticizing it. What does it mean to you? How do you define woke?
There's a lot of things. I mean, you want to start with biological boys playing in girls' sports. That's one thing. The fact that we have gender pronoun classes in the military now. I mean, all of these things that are pushing what a small minority want on the majority of Americans, it's too much. It's too much. I mean, the idea that we have biological boys playing in girls' sports, it is the women's issue of our time. My daughter ran track in high school. I don't even know how I would have that conversation with her. How are we supposed to get our girls used to the fact that biological boys are in their locker rooms? And then we wonder why a third of our teenage girls seriously contemplated suicide last year? We should be growing strong girls.
Okay, all right, let's stop this. First off, she can't define woke. She made it clear. She couldn't define woke. We are talking about maybe hundreds, probably thousands, not even tens of thousands of trans girls who are supposedly in this locker room. There's a reason why, and you covered this last week, The people in this audience have no idea what she's talking about.
Yeah.
They have no personal experience about this. They have had zero concern about what to tell their student athletes about possibly competing against trans people. But here's what's really disgusting. There has been an increase. Put up this graph. There has been an increase in the suicide rate, in particular, amongst 10 to 14-year-olds in this country. And I presume, we don't have this broken down in terms of gender, but I presume that for girls, it has also gone up this way. What is significant about this big jump between 2012 and 2013? What caused this jump? Was it because the Obama administration issued a reminder under, I think it's Title IX, that you need to have shared bathrooms? That would have been amazing because people would have had to be future fortune tellers, because that happened in 2016. The idea that she is attributing an increase in suicide rate to to trans girls being in locker rooms is offensive, both because it's completely based in nothing, but also she must know that we have a problem with things like social media. If you go to 2012, this is when you will see a big jump in the adoption of social media by young kids. This is when they get their smartphones. The 2005, I think, is when smartphones got 50% penetration in the market. Just do the math. I know this from my own daughter. And to falsely attribute it to this is the reasonable Republican.
Yeah.
Is she the most reasonable?
More than 50% of transgender non-binary youth in this country seriously considered suicide in 2022, according to a Trevor Project study. It's pretty high, and disproportionately high compared to any other group when it comes to sexual identification or gender in kids. So that's clearly the bigger problem here, not just their very existence driving other kids to suicide. It's insane.
But that's the reasonable Republican.
Totally.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Steve Vladeck, chair in federal courts at the University of Texas School of Law, author of The Shadow Docket, How the Supreme Court Uses Stealth Rulings to Amass Power and Undermine the Republic. Just a reminder, it's your support that makes this show possible. You can become a member at jointhemajorityReport.com. When you do, you help this show survive and thrive. Also, justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code MAJORITY. You will get 10% off. Quick break. We'll be right back. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Joining us now, Steve Vladeck, chair in federal courts at the University of Texas School of Law, author of The Shadow Docket, How the Supreme Court Uses Stealth Rulings to Amass Power and Undermine the Republic. Steve, welcome. I'm here with Emma Vigland. The Shadow Docket, I had thought I just had not heard about it over the past 10 years, but it is a relatively new, it's relatively new in terms of the amount that it's being used, and the name Shadow Docket is not its official name, but that's what we've come to understand it. Let's start first with what is the merit docket, and then we can move to the so-called shadow docket?
Sure. So the merits docket is basically what we usually think about when we think about decisions from the Supreme Court. When the court takes a case, usually at the end of oftentimes years of litigation, the affirmative action cases, for example, when the court holds oral argument, hands down, lengthy signed opinions, concurrences, dissents, you name it. That's the merits docket. That is what we tend to focus on when we talk about the output of the Supreme Court. But, Sam, Emma, it really turns out that that's only about 1% of the court's output. And most of the other 99% is not stuff we care about. It's not stuff we ought to lose sleep over, but not all of it. And so part of the idea here, part of why I wrote the book is because in the last 6-7 years, we've really seen an uptick in how rulings that are not on the merits docket, rulings that are by tradition unsigned and unexplained, have had far more significant impacts on all of us.
Before we get into that element of it, just in terms of the merits docket, what does having years of court cases that lead to the Supreme Court having a decision written out, having dissent written out, what does that do? What does that provide our legal system, our society, broadly speaking?
Yeah, I think there are three real sort of key characteristics to it. So the first is, of course, you're giving the parties the fullest opportunity to be heard. So there's a meaningful chance for every argument to be made, for every issue to be discovered, for every fact to be uncovered. And so you're actually providing the maximum amount of transparency. Number two, you're giving yourself as judges the most time to actually get it right, to deliberate over the matters, to entertain opposing viewpoints, to go back and forth with your colleagues, to trade drafts. But Sam, the third is the most important. This is what makes courts as opposed to political actors, right? That the sort of this process, the flow, the provision of principled justifications for your decision making is exactly what makes these rulings exercises of what we might call judicial power as opposed to political power. And the Supreme Court itself has said that. The court has said for generations that its legitimacy flows directly from its ability to provide rational, principled, deliberated justifications for its decision making, not because we're all going to agree with the justices' principles, but hopefully because we're going to agree that the decisions are motivated by principles. And that's what has come to characterize historically the merits docket for as long as we've known it.
And we should say, and maybe you can elaborate on this. It is not just the court. These dissents, these decisions do not exist as discrete entities. They are seen in the context of a temporal flow through society that in some ways, like the trunk of a tree has implications for the branch of a tree.
That's exactly right. And so, what gives the court credibility is not that we agree with it. I mean, if we look at the course of American history, right, it's littered with terrible Supreme Court decisions, many of which provoked massive backlash. Rather, it's that we believe, for better or for worse, that the court is acting as a court, and that it's acting in a judicial capacity. And the hallmarks of that are, following ordinary judicial process, providing principled justifications for decision making, and sort of disabusing critics of charges that these are just partisan actors casting partisan votes. Part of why we get so exercised when the Supreme Court reverses a precedent, for example, last term with Dobbs and Roe, is because fealty to precedent, the idea that all things being equal, courts are bound by their predecessors' decisions, is a central part of this story, is a central part of why a court is a court and a political actor is a political actor. And the blurring of that line is part of where we get into, the current pushback against the court. This is, part of the story that I'm trying to tell and that I hope folks will take away if they, pick up the book, is that this push and pull is not actually about the bottom lines that the justices are reaching in any individual case, but rather about the institutional give and take and the institutional process that the justices are following, in individual cases and in the aggregate.
Well, hear me out though, right? Is the shadow docket though refreshing in that instance that it strips the fiction off of all of this, right? In one fell swoop, where we know that they're not making these decisions based on rational calculations, that this is a political body.
So, I mean, I think, Emma, there's certainly something to that. And, there are ways in which properly situating the shadow docket, right? Properly sort of showing how these unsigned, unexplained decisions that have become so much more prominent and visible in the last few years really do seem to be explained best simply by the partisan valence of the dispute, I think does open the court up for even harsher criticism than merits rulings with which we disagree, whether it's Dobbs or the Bruin Second Amendment case. I guess the only thing I would say to sort of slightly to put a softer edge on it is I don't know that in this context it's nearly as deliberate. Like, I'm not sure that the justices are sitting back and saying, oh, we can do it this way, therefore let's do it this way. I think rather it's more that they fell into a bit of a sort of trap that they have been ill-inclined, or at least some have been ill-inclined to dig themselves out of, because they don't want to appear that they're responsive to the very kind of public criticism that at least some of them have lately been, questioning.
I want to get back to that after we examine the shadow docket, but I was my next question was gonna be exactly along the lines of what Emma said there. Like there are two sort of, I think, different critiques here. One is that there are underlying aspects of the Supreme Court that are not just anti-democratic, but that put into question the I guess the pretense, some would call it a pretense, of the way that judges judge, and maybe that's a critical theory argument. And then there's the sort of process, which, like Emma says, the way that the process has been changed over the past 5 or 6 years, and the ease in which it does, I think, sort of maybe lays bare to some truths in that first argument. But let's move to how the process of law in this country has been, it seemed like, very easily just chucked out the window, because we went, talk about like why it gained the name shadow docket when it was officially considered the emergency docket, and how just suddenly, when the court became majority conservative, the definition of emergency seemed to radically change over the course of 12 months.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. So the shadow docket was a term that was coined in 2015 by a conservative law professor at the University of Chicago named Will Bode. And Will did not mean it as a pejorative. He really meant it as this evocative shorthand that was just trying to describe to, folks who don't pay as much attention, nerding out about the Supreme Court's docket, all of the technical stuff the Supreme Court does that can have significant implications. The emergency docket, Sam, is obviously a big piece of that. So just to put this into context, the typical case comes to the Supreme Court, after 2-3 years of litigation, 4 or 5 years of litigation, where you've got the sort of the process working out all the kinks. An emergency application is when, before the case has a chance to get all the way to the Supreme Court, someone asks the Supreme Court to step in and either freeze the status quo or unfreeze the status quo while that case works its way up. And so we're talking about like the Mifepristone case from last month, where we saw the Supreme Court step in to prevent Judge Kaczmarek's order that would have effectively revoked the FDA's approval of Mifepristone on a nationwide basis. Supreme Court steps in and says, no, we're not going to let this go into effect while this case works its way through. Sam, that is not new, right? Like the sort of the notion that the Supreme Court has to have a mechanism for dealing with emergencies is not new. As you said in your question, the real shift we saw starting in 2017 was the court stepping in, was the court agreeing that more cases presented emergencies in context that I suspect none of us would think were emergencies. And the real sort of catalyst was a whole bunch of emergency applications from the Trump administration, where lower courts had blocked Trump policies, immigration policies, the transgender military service ban, you name it. and the government goes to the Supreme Court and says, hey, we'll be back in a couple of years to fight over whether those lower courts were right or not, but we should be able to carry out these policies in the interim. And that's where we saw the court really break from its prior behavior in how often it was granting these applications, in the effects that those orders were having, and Sam, eventually in the inconsistent way in which these unsigned, unexplained rulings tended to favor claims from a Republican president, but once Biden comes to office, not a Democratic president, ditto claims from red states, not blue states. Like, that's where we really saw this blow up starting in 2017.
What do you have? Can you quantify that change over the course of, let's say, from administration to administration?
Sure. I mean, so if we just look at cases where it's the federal government, the most frequent party before the Supreme Court, that's asking the justices for emergency relief, that's saying, hey, we want you to put this policy back into effect while this case goes forward, during the George W. Bush and Obama administration. So, guys, two pretty different two-term presidencies. We saw the Justice Department go to the Supreme Court a total of 8 times, so once every other year. And the court granted 4 of those, denied 4, but 7 had no dissents, right? So the court's rulings tend to be not divisive or especially contentious. In the Trump administration, in 4 years, the executive branch goes to the court 41 times. So, more than 20 times as often. And the court acquiesces in 28 of those cases, 28 times. The justices step in to grant emergency relief. Sam, in a context in which this was allowing Trump to build the border wall, right? This was allowing Trump to carry out asylum policies that every lower court held to be unlawful. And, that's really where we start to see this pattern shift from the obscure once in a blue moon emergency docket of the pre-Trump era to what's really become the norm in the 6 years since.
So in those prior 16 years, under the first 16 years of the 21st century, 8 cases, you say, 7 of which were unanimous.
At least publicly.
And I don't, I don't know what that percentage is. 85%? I don't know. Somewhere around there. What of the 28 during the Trump years that were the court actually, acted upon? Like, were those? How many of those were unanimous?
So one weird thing about writing about all of this is that we don't actually ever know because the votes are not public. But so the way I sort of talk about it in the book is whether there were public dissents. And of the 28 times that the court grants emergency relief to Trump, I think 25 or 26 of them had public dissents.
Wow.
Right. So, I mean, it's clear that this is dividing the justices to a degree we haven't seen before. Those dissents increasingly take on, sort of charges, not just that the substance of the case didn't justify intervention, but that the court was abusing these emergency applications. Justice Sotomayor is the first to level that charge in a September 2019 dissent. So, Sam, I mean, the Trump cases are not the end of the story. They're really the beginning of the story. But that's where we really start to see, to go back to, where you started this, the notion that it's an emergency, or in formal legal terms, that the government is irreparably harmed anytime one of its policies is blocked by a lower court. We had never seen that mentality before. We had never seen this kind of aggressive intervention by the court before.
It's almost as if a word can be interpreted in different ways by different people, as even if the word is written down.
I mean, not only that, yes, I would go even further and just to say that part of what compounds even the sort of interpretive disagreements that in good faith we could say are underlying these disputes, right, is that no one's actually writing down why the court is intervening. So, what compounds all of this is that the normal defense against charges that the court's being inconsistent is missing because the court's not providing any kind of explanation for why it keeps ruling for Trump. So that when, shock of all shocks, right, President Biden comes to office and the very same arguments are made by the Solicitor General, by the federal government, and the court now rejects them, It's not necessarily defying prior rationales because there were no prior rationales.
Right.
That's where it starts to look really bad.
And we will get to this as well, but that is that strikes at the heart of accountability in terms of how the decisions are being made, right? I mean, if I don't know why the first decision, on what grounds it was made, even if I totally disagree, I have no way to address that in the future because it's all just and it could very well, there could be a sort of consistent rationale. The one would imagine people would be happy to provide it if there was a consistent rationale, but there isn't in this. And let's talk about like what the nature. There's really basically two, I guess you could say, silos of major cases that you write about in the book that were where really, in many respects, new law is being created. And I want to talk about that, the general implications of that as well. And how you can have new law created with no underlying explanation about it. But it's essentially COVID and religious liberty. And then the second tranche is voting rights. Let's talk about the first. It's not just COVID regulations, but it was really focused on how it impacted religious people.
That's right. So one of the, I mean, back to the point about how it undermines public confidence when there's no rationale. There were efforts to defend the court's behavior in the Trump cases as being sort of, evanescent, as being a response to this unusual hostility on the part of lower court judges to President Trump. And so, it's just about that. And that's why the COVID cases are important, because here's a context where you have challenges to state laws, not federal laws, where Trump is nowhere in the conversation and where the court is behaving similarly, where we see, the justices accepting emergency challenges to COVID mitigation measures in blue states primarily. On what end up being novel religious exercise grounds, where the court actually ends up handing down a new understanding of freedom of religious exercise in the Constitution, in the context of these, unargued, unsigned, unexplained cases. And that's remarkable, Sam, I think, in two respects. The first is, I think it puts to bed any argument that what happened in the Trump cases was somehow Trump specific and wasn't part of a broader shift in the court and how it approached this. But second, it was incredibly sort of clear just how much of a difference Justice Amy Coney Barrett made in those cases. Because, in the summer of 2020, when Justice Ginsburg is still on the court actually turns away the first slew of these kinds of claims in a case from California, in a case from Nevada, with Chief Justice John Roberts joining the four Democratic appointees in denying relief. As soon as Barrett's on the court, her very first public vote as a justice is to reverse that, is to flip that over, starting right before Thanksgiving in 2020, where now you have a 5-4 majority going the other way, with John Roberts joining the more liberal justices in dissent, all because of this perception that these COVID restrictions were interfering with religious exercise in ways that were unconstitutional. And that's where I think, Sam, you really start to see the gravity of the charge, that this was not just about a, one-sided set of cases involving the Trump administration, but a more profound shift in how the Supreme Court as an institution was approaching these kinds of applications for emergency relief.
And we should also note, and I don't know that it's really an issue in terms of like our audience here, but more broadly speaking, the question of whether COVID was real or dangerous or whatever, completely irrelevant in this situation. And I say that because if we have another pandemic, and it could be one where it's the virus is not nearly as lethal or has the same health implications, Or it could be one like, I don't know, a virus, a novel virus that is like Ebola, where, your eyes liquefy and it happens like that. We don't know. If I'm in a state government, I don't know what I can do at this point because there's absolutely no guidance from the Supreme Court other than we're going to shut it down based upon this notion that, like, well, people in churches, I guess, are protected from the implications of a virus as opposed to people in a movie theater, let's say. Right? I mean, that's one of the big problems here.
So I think that's one of the problems. That would be bad enough, right? I mean, it would be bad enough if the court was intervening to block all of these COVID restrictions without explaining why it was intervening. What makes it even worse, Sam, is that it's intervening in a context in which it's only supposed to be able to rule for the challengers. It's only supposed to be able to block these policies. If the right to relief is, in the words of the court, indisputably clear. And so what's especially galling about the COVID cases is that here's a context where on the court's own interpretations of its authority, it's not supposed to be intervening in close cases. And it's not supposed to be intervening just because it happens to disagree with prior law. And yet the court is repeatedly intervening in order to move the law forward from their perspective, right? In order to change the law. That's exactly what the emergency docket's not supposed to be for, right? The emergency docket's supposed to be for when lower courts have erred so egregiously vis-a-vis the status quo, not as a way of making a new law faster. And that's where, the book has this sort of subtle, but I think pretty clear shift from the sort of the descriptive part of the book to the more critical and prescriptive part of the book. And this is where it gets hard to not be critical of the court, because it's an abuse of the court's procedural rules to do it this way. It's an abuse of the court's sort of institutional relationship with state governments. And it's all in the context in which the court is not providing justifications for these kinds of interventions. And Sam, all while it actually has cases on the merits docket raising the same questions, where if they really wanted to change the law, if they really wanted to revisit these precedents, they actually had a perfectly clean and appropriate vehicle for doing so. That's where it starts to look like this might actually be at least somewhat willful, right, on the justice's part.
So, okay, and just to be clear, to put a finer point on that, the emergency docket had been used as a way of dealing with an immediate miscarriage of the law, as opposed to, and this happens all the time, a sense that the law should evolve. Either the law should evolve in a certain direction, or that past precedent had been problematic and was misdetermined. So when addressing the nature of a law or our understanding of it, emergency docket had never been really used in that way. Only when somebody more egregiously was not following the way that the law was understood by the court.
Because otherwise, how can you show that you're being irreparably harmed by law that isn't settled? Right? I mean, that's the what's supposed to differentiate a court like the Supreme Court intervening early in a case versus waiting for the case to work its normal process through the courts is whether, if we don't intervene now, you, the party asking us to intervene, are going to suffer a harm that we can't fix later, right? That won't be redressed by us ruling for you 6 months, 12 months, 18 months from now. And, Sam, back to where you started, right? I mean, in a world in which we understand irreparable harm traditionally, it is impossible to see how someone can be irreparably harmed by a lower court ruling that faithfully applies existing law. Right? Versus I'm irreparably harmed because the lower court's not changing the law the way I want it to.
I can't hear the phrase irreparable harm without thinking of Bush v. Gore. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how much, and there was at least some theoretical, there was a dissent, but we at least got to read their reasoning in that, and I would say at the very least, and it was about the least in my estimation. But how much did that notion of irreparable harm influence this new, I guess, concept of irreparable harm?
Well, I mean, I think it starts slipping not that, roughly around the same time as Bush versus Gore. I mean, I do think that you can see, especially some of the conservative justices taking a more capacious view of irreparable harm, where it's in the eye of the beholder, right? Where in Bush versus Gore, the irreparable harm was letting the recount continue from the Republicans' perspective. And the irreparable harm from the Democrats' perspective was stopping the recount.
But wasn't the justification of the justices about the irreparable harm to George W. Bush was that he'd already been declared president? And if he's not now, then it's going to make it seem like maybe he's not president.
It'll harm the country, right? In the sense that there will be faith will be undermined in democracy.
No, my understanding is that the irreparable harm was specifically to George W. Bush as a candidate.
So, I mean, so Sam, that's what Scalia says later in public speeches. In the actual opinion, right, the harm that justifies the court's intervention. And let me just add sort of one piece of context. Bush versus Gore started as an emergency application in the Supreme Court, but the justices understood that they couldn't end it that way. So they actually turned it into a merits case. They actually, expedited the heck out of it. Had what sort of passes for regular briefing on a hyper expedited schedule, held oral arguments and everything. I mean, they gave it the full 9 yards. The justification that the majority, I would say, invented in Bush versus Gore was the need to meet the so-called safe harbor deadline of the Electoral Count Act of 1887. That it would irreparably harm Florida voters if Florida was not able to certify a victor by the safe harbor deadline, and that was what justified stopping the recount. We could probably do hours on whether that was valid and persuasive analysis. What I'll say is, at least it was analysis. I mean, right? They explained the damn thing, right? Contrasted with the last year's Alabama redistricting case, where a 5-4 majority over a dissent from, among others, John Roberts. Great fan of the Voting Rights Act, where a 5-4 majority allowed Alabama to use an unlawful congressional district map with no explanation whatsoever, Sam, in a ruling that could very well have altered the balance of power in the House of Representatives.
Let's talk about the court and the Purcell. Is it the Purcell doctrine? Is it?
That's what they call it.
Right. Okay. And this is. It seems to have been updated to when it impacts a potential Democratic win, then we don't feel as worried about upending the laws. But if we think that the Republican win is locked in, then we're okay. But will you give it a less tainted definition?
So, I mean, Purcell itself is a shadow docket ruling. I mean, Purcell itself was a ruling in 2006, which the Supreme Court decided without regular briefing and without oral argument. And, the principle at the heart of it is actually not that objectionable. The principle is just that as we get closer and closer to Election Day, federal courts should be especially wary about any injunction that could confuse voters, right? That, like, in general, we don't want to change the rules on the eve of an election in a way that confuses voters. If you say it that way, it sounds perfectly reasonable, right? The problem is that the court has applied it in a manner that is so facially inconsistent, right? In the Alabama case, Election Day was 9 months away, right? And the primary was 4 months away. That it really does smack of partisanship when Purcell is trotted out to justify blocking lower court rulings that appear to favor Democratic voters, but not blocking lower court rulings that appear to favor Republican voters. And, the book tries to offer receipts to show that that's exactly how you could characterize the court's interventions and non-interventions in 2020. Sam, what this all gets back to is there might be neutral, plausible, defensible reasons why the justices voted one way in case A and the other way in case B. Because they're not providing those rationales, right? It really undermines public faith that the neutral principles are what's doing the work here.
And I mean, it also, I think, I mean, I think it also could be the reason why that that they are using this method is because there are no principles at work here, at least ones that people would think are judicial in any way. Talk about how the pushback to this and how they have responded, and by they I mean maybe Sam Alito, how they have responded to it, but how the court has also responded to the claims that they were overusing the shadow docket, and whether that's also just not, even their response is not inconsistent with the potential charge that they're deploying it when it's at most favorable for a Republican administration.
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating to watch. One of the awkward things about writing a book about unfolding events is that events unfold around the book. But I think this is where we see the court as a they, not an it, and I do think that there's a growing divide between, for example, Alito on one hand, who has been very critical publicly, not just of the shadow docket criticism, but of me by name, right? Where the charge is that this is not really a good faith effort. The charge is that this is just people who are unhappy with the results, who are trying to further attack and delegitimize the current conservative majority. I think there are lots of pretty straightforward responses to that. One is just to point out cases where I think the court reached the wrong result, but the right way. And the flip side, cases where the court, I think, reached the right result, but the wrong way. I mean, those exist. I talk about them in the book. Sam, the bigger point is that Alito increasingly doesn't appear to be in the majority on this. So we have seen, especially since late 2021, I think a real softening in the approach and the aggressiveness of Justice Barrett and Justice Kavanaugh, where now we're seeing more and more cases like the Mifepristone case, where some combination of Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch are dissenting, and the court is otherwise hewing to the more traditional norms for these kinds of cases. So I guess it's a two-part story. For Alito and Thomas and Gorsuch, these criticisms have been unfair. They've been, sort of bad faith efforts to delegitimize the court. But for Barrett and Kavanaugh, they appear to have hit home, where we're not seeing them vote for emergency relief as often, where, we're seeing efforts to actually take contentious cases that start on the shadow docket, like the student loan cases, and kick them onto the merits docket, where there seems to be some awareness that this is actually not a good way for the court to run the railroad.
But are we comparing apples to apples in this sense, in that these cases that have been showing up in the emergency docket are not initiated by the federal government, right? In the way that they were during the Trump administration.
So there's some of them that's true, but Sam, some of them that's not true. I mean, so in the Mifepristone case, the Food and Drug Administration was one of the parties that sought emergency relief from the court.
Okay.
Right, there have been a couple of immigration cases. The Navy SEALs vaccine mandate, that was the Biden administration asking the court to step in. The CMS healthcare worker vaccine mandate from last year, that was also. So, I don't think it's quite so easy to say it's apples and oranges. I think the broader point is that there's still some bad behavior, but that maybe the high water mark is behind us, right? That the crux of the court doing whatever the heck it wanted on the shadow docket was, 2021, perhaps culminating with the SB 8 ruling, the ruling that refused to block Texas's, controversial 6-week abortion ban. And I think what's telling about that is that, I think it was after the SB 8 ruling in September 2021 that a lot of folks first became familiar with the shadow docket as a phenomenon. Right? You see sort of much more public discussion and discourse about it. You see much more public criticism about it. Justice Alito gives his first public speech defending it, right, not that long thereafter. And to me, there's actually a bit of an optimistic message there, which is that here's a context where the more the public understood what the court was doing and the more the public reacted badly to what the court was doing, the more at least some of the justices seemed to moderate their behavior. That to me is actually a useful story about the moment we're in, far more so than, when Alito says anyone who attacks us is trying to delegitimize us.
What are other mechanisms of reform that we could pursue that are less contingent upon, bad PR for the court, which,
or or the justices feeling shame.
Yeah, I mean, I think they probably all have their different lines in which that shame kicks in. I suspect for, 2 or 3 of them, that line is imperceptible to the human eye. But what can we do as a society to structurally, because we're also having an accountability issue in terms of ethics at this point, and we don't seem to have a mechanism, or to the extent that we do, a mechanism is not being used to in any way call these people to account whose decisions now impact the lives of millions upon millions of people. They just reversed an individual right for the first time in 50 years. You'd know better than I, and maybe it's the first time ever that an individual right has been rescinded, not through the shadow docket necessarily, although the Texas case set up, right? I mean, in many respects, set that up. What can be done?
So, I mean, I think the ethics story is actually just the opposite side of the same coin. And the coin here is the lack of accountability. So, the book starts with a chapter about the history of the court's relationship with Congress, and how for so much of the court's history, really the first 200 years, Congress was actively involved and invested in regulating the court's docket, in supervising the court, in pulling levers, to keep the court from getting too far out of step. And what has shifted so dramatically in the last really 35 years is that Congress has just gotten out of that ballgame. And that's, I think, reflected in the rise of the shadow docket. It's reflected in the decline of the merits docket. The court is hearing fewer cases these days on the merits docket than at any point since the 1860s, when we were, just fighting a civil war. The ethics piece is, I think, consistent with that, the notion that there's no mechanism by which anyone other than the justices can hold themselves accountable for, egregious personal behavior. And so, Sam, I think that what can be done is, at the bottom, at the very beginning, anything to resurrect that relationship, anything to bring back the idea that judicial independence and judicial accountability are not mutually exclusive, and that Congress actually has an institutional obligation to exert control, to exert pressure on the justices, not to reach any specific ruling in any specific case. That's the court's job, but rather to keep the court just sort of generally within the lines of acceptable accountability. That, to me, is where we've totally run off the rails, and that's where I think the conversation has to start.
Do you have a theory as to why there has been a diminishment of the number of merits cases? I mean, is that a function of like things are more contentious on the court? Is it that people are shy?
So, I mean, I think some people are shy. I mean, if I were, progressive right now, I'd be trying to avoid Supreme Court review of ideological cases like the plague. But Sam, I think it really comes back to, the justices there's no pressure on them to take any cases other than the ones they want, right? There's no pressure on them to take any cases other than the ones that advance the broader ideological project. And so that means that, like, what's disappearing from the docket are, technical cases that are of interest to lawyers, but not necessarily, in line with current social debates. Direct appeals of criminal convictions, especially in state courts, have virtually disappeared from the docket. And I think, what that reflects, Sam, is just the conservative justices feel no obligation to any constituency to take any cases other than the ones that are, their bread and butter. And that had not been true at any prior point. I mean, until 1891, the court had zero control over its docket. Until 1925, it had virtually zero control over its docket. Till 1988, it only had sort of partial control over its docket. So, to me, these are all sort of telling the same story about a court that just doesn't feel beholden to anything or anyone other than itself. That's where the public pressure story becomes important, right? Because that's the most obvious entry point into actually trying to exert pressure for reform.
Who had control over the docket in those?
Congress.
They could.
Right,
They would specifically have classes of cases that must go to the Supreme Court, or did they do it individually?
Classes of cases. So until 1891, if the Supreme Court had jurisdiction over a case, it had to hear it. Right until 1925, that was true for any case coming from, with a couple of sort of scattershot exceptions. I mean, Sam, it's still true today. It's just true for such a small category of cases that no one knows about it, right? There are a small set of campaign finance and redistricting cases over which the Supreme Court today is still required to hear appeals. It's just that's like one case per term. And that was the norm until not so long ago. So restoring this dynamic, bringing back the idea that, the court really operates not at the whim of Congress, but, with the sort of ongoing dynamic interbranch relationship with Congress, I think is really a sort of structural way to get at a whole bunch of these different flashpoints.
Yeah, it's important I think, for people to be aware of just how much influence or how much of a role Congress has in these things that we have come to understand. The Supreme Court is like sort of standing above on Mount Olympus without any constraints that are allowed by Congress, and that's just not the case. Steve Vladeck, chair in federal courts at the University of Texas School of Law. The book is Shadow Docket: How the Supreme Court Uses Stealth Rulings to Amass Power and Undermine the Republic. We'll put a link at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really interesting.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break, and then we will head into the fun half of the program, wherein we will have
fun.
Lots
of fun.
So much fun. Just a reminder, it's your support that makes this show possible. When you become a member at jointhemajorityreport.com, you get the free half free of commercials. Now, we didn't have any commercials today. We're going through a thing. It's we have switched our media broker because the podcast world essentially moved into dynamic advertising. That didn't work for us. Or dynamic insertion, DIA, dynamic insertion advertising.
There we go.
It didn't work for us for a whole host of reasons. And so we found a new media broker, and it's going to take a while for them to sort of get up to speed. In the meantime, you can help us out if you listen to the program with any type of regularity, and you've got some extra cash in your media budget. JoinTheMajorityReport.com. Also, don't forget, JustCoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code MAJORITY, get 10% off. Read the AM Quickie. It's free 3 days a week. And I will tell you right now, because I see people who sign up for it. I mean, I don't see all of them, but sometimes a name catches my eye. I'm not going to be honest with you. I'm not on top of it all the time. But it is being read, I know, not necessarily in the halls of Congress, probably on the way, people's way to Congress. These are not people I necessarily know personally, but I recognize certain names. And I believe, like, also probably en route to the White House.
Whoa.
We have folks, activists read it, union members, and you can be part of that as well. Some of it's, sort of like stuff you can find in the mainstream, but other it's stories that you will not find in the mainstream. amquickie.com. Emma.
Yes.
What game are we on now with the championship?
We had game 2 last night, which was very exciting. It's a series. It is a series. I mean, it starts when you win on the road. So the Miami Heat won on the road last night.
They did?
Yeah. Yeah.
He won by I think 3. It was 3. I think just 3, right? It was.
Well, it was at the end there was a shot by Jamal Murray and
missed.
where he could have tied it, but I mean,
how did that happen?
They're just.
This is their game. They play in the garbage. That's what
they
like
are
to
just
do.
incredibly
They're
disciplined defensively, and we'll talk more about that as well. They also were able to get some just more scoring from different parts of their team. It was too much
That
on
they didn't
Jokic
have
last
in
night.
Game 1, yeah.
Yeah. So we will talk about all of that as well as the Golden Knights taking Game 1. I want to touch on, too, is horse racing facing some sort of reckoning here because Churchill Downs had to shut down because they're just killing a bunch of horses. YouTube.com/ESPN show.
All right. And check out, do we have any idea of...
Well, I can say that, at least for my part, Left Reckoning with Matt has unlocked my appearance on the show, so you can go to youtube.com/Left Reckoning. Whoa! And check that out. And I don't know who's going to be on tomorrow.
Yeah,
night.
we don't know about tomorrow, but last week we friend of the show and AM Quickie writer Corey Pine was on last week to discuss space travel for the rich, as well as another friend of the show, Issy Bear-Breen, comms director for Representative Ilhan Omar, also joined the boys to talk about the Minnesota legislature's recent victory. So go check that out, and then they'll be back tomorrow.
All right, folks. 646-257-3920 is the number. We shall see you in the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just want to degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ.
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. See white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males,
psych, fuck them. Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank, okay? I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank.
All lives matter. Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are black. And the Africans are back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keep it at 100.
Can't knock the hustle.
Come on, fuck them. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday. Happy birthday to me, Jew boy. I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are black. Africans are back.
Come on. Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
We're back.
We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigland, fun half of the Majority Report. What did I?
No, it's just there's just some silence when we came back.
That's all right. Folks can handle that. You gotta give people some credit. Yeah, maybe
the monkeys in the audience they can't handle any silence.
Maybe the sound's out.